Certified incident briefings. Real video evidence. Strict accountability. You are viewing Bodycam incident reports.
Officer, look at me. I'm 62 years old.
I'm wearing a suit. I'm drinking coffee. I don't care who you are! On the ground! Now!
You are making a mistake that'll follow you for the rest of your life.
Hands where I can see them. Do not test me.
I'm not testing you, officer. I'm documenting you.
Officer, look at me. I am 62 years old. I am wearing a suit. I am drinking a cup of coffee. You are making a mistake that is going to follow you for the rest of your life. I don't care who you are on the ground. The body camera footage that would eventually be played on every major news network in America captures this moment with terrifying clarity. It was 10:15 on a Tuesday morning in purely average American suburbia. The sun was shining, birds were chirping, and Officer Kyle Vance, a 28-year-old patrolman with an aggressive haircut and an even more aggressive attitude, was screaming at a man old enough to be his father. Officer Vance saw a threat. He saw a vagrant loitering in a public park. He saw defiance. But Officer Vance didn't know who he was screaming at. He didn't know that the man sitting on the bench methodically marking a page in his hardcover book before closing it was Marcus Thorne. He didn't know that Marcus Thorne had commanded an infantry battalion in the Gulf War. He didn't know that Marcus Thorne had a Bronze Star for valor. And he certainly didn't know that Marcus Thorne was currently the senior federal advocate for Veteran Affairs, a man who reported directly to the Oversight Committee in Washington, D.C., and whose specific job description involved auditing federal grants for law enforcement agencies. Marcus Thorne wasn't panicking. He wasn't begging. He was analyzing. His heart rate conditioned by actual combat and decades of high-level negotiations barely ticked upward. He looked at Officer Vance not with fear, but with a mixture of pity and disappointment. "Officer," Marcus set his voice a deep resonant baritone that carried authority without needing volume. "My name is Marcus Thorne. I have identification in my left breast pocket. I am going to reach for it slowly." "Don't you move," Vance shouted, his hand hovering over his taser. "You don't reach for anything until I tell you to, before we watch this situation spiral completely out of control. I need you to take a second. Look at where you are right now. Maybe you're sitting in your car. Maybe you're on your couch. Imagine if a police officer walked up to you right now and demanded you lie face down in the dirt for absolutely no reason. Would you do it, or would you stand on your dignity? Drop a comment below. Would you comply, or would you assert your rights? And if you believe that a badge is a responsibility, not a license to bully, hit that subscribe button. We cover the stories that the system tries to bury. The woman sitting on the adjacent bench, a grandmother named Mrs. Gable who had been feeding pigeons, froze. She pulled out her phone. Her hands were shaking, but she hit record. She knew just by looking at the dynamic that something terrible was happening. "I'm going to ask you one time," Vance said, stepping into Marcus's personal space, violating every de-escalation protocol in the book. "Stand up, turn around, and put your hands behind your back." "For what crime?" Marcus asked. He didn't move. He remained seated, his posture upright, his eyes locked on Vance's nameplate. "For failure to comply with a lawful order." "A lawful order must be based on a lawful detention," Marcus replied, his voice steady. "And a lawful detention requires reasonable suspicion that a crime has been, is being, or is about to be committed. So I ask you again, Officer Vance, and I am noting your badge number 492. What crime do you suspect me of committing while I sit here reading a biography of Ulysses S. Grant?" Vance didn't have an answer. He didn't have a crime. He had an ego problem and a badge. And in that moment, he decided that his authority mattered more than the law. 30 minutes prior to the screaming, the scene had been idyllic. Elmwood Park was the kind of place realtors put on brochures. Manicured grass walking paths, a decorative fountain that bubbled pleasantly in the mid-morning air. It was a place where retirees walked their golden retrievers and young mothers pushed strollers. Marcus Thorne had come here for silence. He had arrived in town the night before for a conference on veteran homelessness. His flight back to D.C. wasn't until that evening. He had checked out of his hotel, put his luggage in the trunk of his rental car, a sensible gray sedan parked legally on the street, and walked into the park with a cup of black coffee and a book. He was dressed in a charcoal gray suit, no tie, the top button of his white shirt undone. He looked exactly like what he was, a professional taking a break. He sat on a bench near the fountain, crossed his legs, and began to read. He wasn't bothering anyone. He wasn't soliciting. He wasn't shouting. He was existing. Officer Kyle Vance was on routine patrol. Vance was 3 years into the job, and he was already developing a reputation in the precinct. He was what the older sergeants called a hunter. He didn't wait for calls. He went looking for trouble. He believed that his presence alone should command total submission. He had been cruising past the park when he saw Marcus. To Vance, Marcus didn't belong. It wasn't explicit, but it was there. A black man alone sitting on a bench in this neighborhood looking at people. In Vance's mind, that translated to casing the area. Vance parked his cruiser, adjusted his utility belt, and walked over. He didn't wave. He didn't say good morning. "What are you doing here?" Vance had asked as his opening salvo. Marcus had looked up over his reading glasses. "I beg your pardon." "I said, what are you doing here? You live around here." Marcus marked his page. "I am reading officer. Is there a problem?" "We've had reports of loitering in this park." Vance lied. There had been no reports. The dispatch logs would later confirm this. "Loitering implies remaining in a public place without an apparent purpose," Marcus said, closing his book. "My purpose is recreation. This is a public park. Therefore, I am not loitering." "Let me see your ID," Vance demanded. This is the pivot point. This is the moment where the Constitution clashes with street-level enforcement. Marcus Thorne knew the law better than Officer Vance ever would. He knew Terry versus Ohio. He knew Brown versus Texas. He knew that in a consensual encounter he was under no obligation to provide identification. "Officer," Marcus said, removing his glasses. "Am I being detained or am I free to go?" "I'm asking for your ID." "And I am asking if I am being detained. If I am not detained, I am not required to provide identification. If I am detained, you are required to articulate the reasonable suspicion that justifies that detention. Which is it?" Vance's face flushed red. He wasn't used to people knowing the rules. He was used to fear. He was used to people handing over their licenses because they were afraid of what would happen if they didn't. "You're being smart with me," Vance snapped. "I am being accurate," Marcus corrected. "There is a difference. I am a citizen exercising my Fourth Amendment rights. You are a public servant who seems to be confusing a consensual encounter with an investigatory stop. Unless you can articulate a specific crime, I am going to return to my book." Marcus opened the book again. He dismissed Vance. He turned his attention back to the page. That was the insult Officer Vance couldn't handle. It wasn't the law, it was the dismissal. A black man in a suit had just told him no and ignored him. "Put the book down." Vance barked his hand, dropping to his holster. "Stand up, now." "We are past the point of conversation, then," Marcus said, his voice dropping an octave. "You are now initiating a seizure under the Fourth Amendment. I want you to be very aware that everything happening from this second forward is being recorded not just by your camera, but by the public." He gestured slightly to Mrs. Gable, who was now holding her phone up like a shield. "I don't care about her," Vance yelled. "Stand up." The air in the park seemed to vibrate with tension. The birds had stopped singing, or maybe it just felt that way. Other people in the park had stopped walking. A jogger, a man in his 50s with headphones around his neck, slowed to a halt, about 30 feet away. "Officer, he's just reading a book," the jogger called out. "Back up," Vance screamed, turning his head momentarily. "Do not interfere with the police investigation." "There is no investigation," Marcus said calmly. "There is only harassment." Vance lunged. He didn't wait for compliance. He grabbed Marcus by the left arm, digging his fingers into the expensive fabric of the suit jacket. He yanked Marcus upward. Marcus didn't fight back. He didn't pull away. He allowed the momentum to bring him to his feet, but he kept his balance. He was 6 feet 2 inches broad-shouldered and stood with the natural grounded stance of a man who had spent 20 years in the military. "Turn around," Vance shouted, twisting Marcus's arm behind his back with unnecessary force. A sharp pain shot through Marcus's rotator cuff, an old injury from his service days, but he didn't flinch. He didn't give Vance the satisfaction of a reaction. "I am complying," Marcus announced loudly for the benefit of the witnesses. "I am offering no resistance. You are applying excessive force to a compliant subject." "Shut up." Vance shoved Marcus forward, forcing him to bend at the waist. He grabbed his handcuffs. The metallic rashe-rashe sound of the cuffs tightening echoed in the stillness of the park. Vance tightened them too hard. He did it on purpose. It was a petty, punitive measure. "You are under arrest," Vance panted, adrenaline flooding his system. "For what?" Marcus asked, his face pressed awkwardly towards the ground, but his dignity intact. "Resisting arrest, disorderly conduct, failure to identify." Vance was listing charges that wouldn't stick throwing spaghetti at the wall. Marcus took a deep breath. He needed to be very clear. "Officer, listen to me closely. You have just violated Title 42, Section 1983 of the United States Code. You have deprived me of my civil rights under the color of law. You have no probable cause. You have no reasonable suspicion. You are currently operating outside the scope of your qualified immunity." "You a lawyer?" Vance sneered, patting Marcus down, roughly checking his pockets. He pulled out Marcus's wallet. "I am something much worse for you," Marcus said softly. "I am the man who audits the federal funding that pays for your body armor and your cruiser, and I am telling you right now to check that wallet before you put me in that car." Vance ignored him. He didn't open the wallet. He shoved it into his own pocket. He didn't want to see anything that contradicted his narrative. He wanted to win. "You can tell it to the judge," Vance said, spinning Marcus around. "Oh, I will," Marcus replied. "But by the time I do, you won't be an officer anymore." Vance laughed. It was a nervous, arrogant laugh. "Yeah, I've heard that before. Walk." He marched Marcus across the grass to the patrol car. Mrs. Gable was still filming. "I have it all," she shouted, her voice trembling. "I have everything. He didn't do anything." "Keep recording, ma'am," Marcus called out to her, his voice calm and reassuring. "Please secure that footage. Do not delete it." "Get in the car." Vance shoved Marcus's head down, guiding him into the cramped back seat of the cruiser. The hard plastic seat was uncomfortable. The cuffs bit into Marcus's wrists. The door slammed shut, sealing him in the cage. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment. He wasn't praying. He was organizing his strategy. He was memorizing timestamps. He was formatting the legal complaint in his mind. He felt a cold, hard resolve settling in his chest. This young man had wanted a war. He had just declared it on a general. The drive to the precinct took 15 minutes. They were the longest 15 minutes of Officer Vance's life, though he didn't know it yet. He tried to turn on the radio, some aggressive talk radio station. But the silence from the back seat was unnerving. Usually people in the back of the car did one of three things: they cried, they cursed, or they bargained. "Please, officer, I can't go to jail. I have work tomorrow." "Officer, you're a pig." "Officer, come on, give me a break." Marcus Thorne did none of those things. He sat perfectly upright, staring at the back of Vance's head through the plexiglass divider. He was silent. It was a tactical silence. It was the silence of a predator waiting for the trap to spring. Vance glanced in the rearview mirror. Marcus's eyes met his. Vance looked away first. When they pulled into the sally port of the precinct, the automatic door rattled down behind them. The garage was dim and smelled of exhaust and stale coffee. Vance got out and opened the rear door. "Let's go," Vance said, his voice losing some of its earlier bravado. Marcus stepped out. His suit was wrinkled now. His wrists were throbbing, but he walked with his head high. Vance led him through the secure hallway, buzzing through the heavy steel doors and into the booking area. The booking desk was manned by Sergeant Thomas Miller. Miller was 58 years old, a black man with gray stubble and tired eyes. He had been on the force for 25 years. He had seen every kind of cop come and go, and he had little patience for the hotshots like Vance. Miller looked up from his computer. He saw Vance pushing a well-dressed older black man in handcuffs. Miller's eyes narrowed. He looked at the suit. He looked at the demeanor. He looked at the lack of resistance. "What do we have here, Vance?" Miller asked, his voice flat. "Disorderly resisting failure to ID." Vance rattled off, pushing Marcus toward the bench. "Guy wouldn't listen. Caused a scene in the park." Miller looked at Marcus. "That true?" "It is not," Marcus said. "I was reading a book. Officer Vance took exception to my request for a legal justification for his harassment." Miller sighed. He knew the tone. He knew the vocabulary. Legal justification, harassment. This wasn't a drunk from the park. "Uncuff one hand so he can sign the property receipt," Miller said. Vance unlocked one cuff. Marcus rubbed his wrist. There were deep red indentations where the metal had cut into his skin. "Property," Miller said. Vance pulled the items from his pockets. The book, a biography of Grant, a heavy set of keys, a Mont Blanc fountain pen, and the wallet. Vance tossed the wallet onto the counter. "There's his ID. Refused to show it to me." Miller picked up the wallet. It was high-quality leather. He opened it. The first thing he saw was not a driver's license. It was a badge, but not a police badge. It was a silver shield with the Department of Defense seal. Miller paused. He looked at Vance, who was filling out paperwork, oblivious. Miller looked back at the wallet. He flipped the flap. There was a federal identification card, Marcus Aurelius Thorne, Senior Advocate, Department of Veterans Affairs, security clearance top secret, and behind that a laminated card, Congressional Liaison, United States House Committee on Veterans Affairs. Sergeant Miller felt the blood drain from his face. He closed the wallet slowly. He looked at Marcus. "Mr. Thorne?" Miller said, his voice completely different now. Respectful, cautious. "You're with the VA. I am the senior federal advocate," Marcus corrected. "And I am in town to audit the grant compliance for state agencies, including this one." The typing stopped. Vance froze. "Excuse me," Vance said, turning around. "You arrested a federal auditor," Miller said, staring at Vance with a look that suggested Vance should start updating his resume immediately. "You arrested a congressional liaison." He refused to ID," Vance stammered. "He was acting suspicious." "Sergeant," Marcus said, ignoring Vance completely. "I would like to speak to your watch commander immediately, and I want the handcuffs off. Now." Miller didn't wait for Vance. He walked around the desk with a key. "Vance, step back," Miller ordered. "Sarge, you can't just—" "I said, step back," Miller barked, snapping the cuffs off Marcus's wrists. "Mr. Thorne, I apologize. I'm going to get Captain Reynolds. Please take a seat. Can I get you some water?" "I don't want water," Marcus said, rubbing his wrists. "I want my phone. I need to make a call to the United States Attorney's office." Vance stood there, his mouth slightly open as the gravity of his mistake began to crash down on him like a collapsing building. Captain Reynolds was a politician in a uniform. He was smooth, he was careful, and he was currently eating a turkey sandwich in his office when Sergeant Miller knocked on the door and entered without waiting for an invitation. "Captain, we have a code red situation in booking," Miller said. Reynolds wiped mustard from his lip. "Did someone die?" Professionally. "Yes. Officer Vance just arrested Marcus Thorne." Reynolds frowned. "Who?" "Marcus Thorne, the keynote speaker for the Police Benevolent Association Gala next Tuesday. The guy from Washington, the guy who signs off on the federal equipment grants." Reynolds dropped his sandwich. "You're joking. He's in the lobby, in handcuffs. Well, I took them off, but he's charging false arrest deprivation of rights, and he's currently on the phone with the U.S. attorney." Reynolds was out of his chair and moving before Miller finished the sentence. When they got to the booking area, the atmosphere was funereal. Other officers were standing around whispering. Vance was standing in the corner looking pale and defensive. Marcus Thorne was standing by the desk holding his phone to his ear. "Yes, federal civil rights violation," Marcus was saying into the phone. "I want a preservation order sent to the chief within the hour. No, do not let them touch the servers. Thank you." Marcus hung up and turned to Reynolds. "Mr. Thorne," Reynolds said, extending a hand. "I'm Captain Reynolds. I am so terribly sorry about this misunderstanding." Marcus didn't shake the hand. He looked at it, then looked at Reynolds. "Captain, this was not a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding is when you misread a parking sign. This was a calculated deprivation of liberty by an officer who believes his badge gives him the right to hunt citizens for sport." "We can discuss this in my office," Reynolds said, sweating slightly. "Please, let's get you out of here." "No," Marcus said. "We will stay right here. I want Officer Vance to hear this. Is that him?" Marcus pointed at Vance. "Officer Vance, get over here," Reynolds barked. Vance walked over, trying to muster some defiance. "Captain, he refused a lawful order. I had reasonable suspicion." "Suspicion of what, Vance?" Reynolds shouted. "Suspicion of literacy. Suspicion of sitting while black. I watched the body cam feed on my tablet on the way down here." "You asked him what he was doing. He told you and you didn't like his tone. That's not a crime." He fit the description," Vance mumbled. "What description?" Marcus cut in. "The description of a suspicious person, officer. I am a 62-year-old combat veteran. I have held a security clearance longer than you have been alive. I was reading a book about General Grant. The only thing suspicious was your inability to leave an innocent man alone." Reynolds turned to Vance. "Badge and gun. On the desk, now." "Captain, you can't." "Now!" Reynolds screamed. "You are relieved of duty pending an internal investigation. Get out of my sight." Vance slowly unbuckled his belt. His hands were shaking. He placed the heavy leather belt on the counter. The sound was a dull thud that signaled the end of his career. He looked at Marcus, eyes filled with hate, but he said nothing. He turned and walked out the back door. "Mr. Thorne," Reynolds said, his voice trembling, "please, let us make this right. We can drop all charges immediately. You don't get to drop charges that never should have existed," Marcus said coldly. "And you don't get to make this right with an apology. You have a systemic problem in this department, Captain. That officer felt comfortable doing what he did because he's done it before, and nobody stopped him. Until today." Marcus Thorne did not leave the station. Most people, once told they were free to go, would have run out the door. Marcus stood his ground. "I want the written incident report," Marcus said. "I want a copy of the booking sheet. I want the digital file of the body camera footage burned to a drive before I leave this building." "Mr. Thorne, that usually takes a few days to process through records," Miller said apologetically. "I know how long it takes," Marcus replied. I also know that processing is often a euphemism for editing or losing data. I am not leaving until I have the raw evidence. If you need to call the chief of police, call him. If you need to call the mayor, call him. I have all day. My flight isn't until 8 p.m. For the next 3 hours, the precinct was held hostage by one man in a wrinkled suit. The chief of police arrived. The city attorney arrived. They tried to talk Marcus into a conference room. He refused. He sat on a bench in the lobby, a different bench, but the symbolism was heavy and weighted. He made calls. He didn't call a local defense attorney. He called the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. He called the Inspector General's office. He called the head of the Veterans Congressional Committee. "Yes, Senator," Marcus said, loud enough for the chief to hear. "It appears the department receiving the $2 million tactical grant is using it to harass veterans in public parks. Yes, I think a full audit is necessary. Freeze the funds. I think that would be prudent." The chief of police, a man named Henderson, looked like he was having a stroke. Losing the federal grant would bankrupt their tactical unit. It would mean layoffs. It was a disaster. "Mr. Thorne," Chief Henderson said, approaching him, "please, we will handle Vance. We will throw the book at him. But don't punish the whole department." Marcus looked up. "Chief, if one bad apple spoils the bunch, it's because the bunch didn't toss it out. You let him wear that uniform. You let him patrol. You are responsible." At 2:30 p.m., Marcus walked out of the station. He held a manila envelope containing the incident report and a USB drive with the unedited footage. He walked to the curb where an Uber was waiting. He didn't look back at the building. He had what he needed. The war was just beginning. The lawsuit was filed on Monday morning. Thorne versus City Vance et al. It alleged violation of Fourth Amendment rights, false arrest, false imprisonment, excessive force, and malicious prosecution. But the real damage happened on social media. Mrs. Gable, the grandmother from the park, had gone home and shown the video to her grandson. Her grandson posted it to TikTok and Twitter. The caption read, "Cop arrests harmless vet for reading a book." By Wednesday, it had 10 million views. The image of Marcus Thorne, dignified and calm, being shoved by the aggressive young officer sparked outrage across the political spectrum. Conservatives were furious that a veteran was treated this way. Liberals were furious at the racial profiling. For a rare moment, America was united in its disgust for Officer Vance. The Internal Affairs investigation, under pressure from the DOJ, went deep. They didn't just look at this stop. They looked at Vance's history. They found a pattern. Over the last 18 months, Vance had stopped 43 people in Elmwood Park. 38 of them were Black or Hispanic men over the age of 50. He had issued citations for loitering that were almost all dismissed in court. He had a nickname in the text messages of his patrol group, the Park Ranger. He targeted older men because he thought they were easy. He thought they wouldn't fight back. He thought they were powerless. He had no idea that he was building the evidence for a federal civil rights lawsuit. The investigation also revealed that 3 supervisors had signed off on Vance's evaluations, noting his proactive policing as a positive. They had ignored the racial disparity. They had ignored the complaints. The Department of Justice announced a pattern or practice investigation into the entire city's police force. The federal grants were frozen indefinitely. The city was in chaos. 6 months later, Marcus Thorne sat in a conference room in a high-rise building downtown. Across the table sat the city attorney, the chief of police, and a team of lawyers. They looked defeated. "Mr. Thorne," the city attorney said, "we are prepared to offer the settlement figure we discussed, $850,000, and a formal public apology from the mayor." Marcus looked at the paperwork. It was a lot of money. It was enough to buy a nice house. It was enough to retire. "And Officer Vance?" Marcus asked. "Terminated," the chief said, "and decertified. He will never work in law enforcement in this state again." We've also forwarded his file to the DA for potential criminal charges for filing a false report. And the supervisors, Marcus pressed. The ones who called his harassment proactive. Demoted, and mandatory retraining for the entire command staff on Fourth Amendment compliance, the chief said. Plus, we are accepting the federal oversight monitor for the next 3 years. Marcus picked up his pen, the same Mont Blanc pen he had in the park that day. He signed the document. He didn't keep a dime. The next day, a press conference was held. Marcus stood at the podium. He announced the creation of the Thorn Legal Defense Fund for Veterans. The entire $850,000 would go to providing legal representation for veterans who were victims of police misconduct. I was lucky, Marcus told the cameras. I had the knowledge, I had the resources, I had the credentials, but dignity shouldn't depend on your credentials. The Constitution doesn't care if you're a federal advocate or a janitor. It protects us all, or at least it should. He looked directly into the camera. Officer Vance thought he was arresting a vagrant. He thought he was taking out the trash. He forgot that the man on the bench was a citizen, and in this country the citizen is the highest rank there is. Never forget that. The story of Marcus Thorn isn't just about a bad cop. It's about what happens when good people refuse to be bullied. It's about the power of knowing your rights and having the courage to sit still when everything in you wants to run. It's been a year since the incident. Marcus is back in D.C. still fighting for veterans. Officer Vance is working at a warehouse loading boxes. The park is quiet. But every officer in that city drives a little slower past Elmwood Park now. They look at the benches, and they remember. What would you have done in Marcus's shoes? Would you have been able to stay that calm? It's easy to say yes, but when the cuffs are going on, fear takes over. Marcus showed us that knowledge is the only thing stronger than fear. If this story moved you, if you believe in accountability, share this with someone who needs to know their rights. Drop a like to help the algorithm spread the truth. And remember to subscribe. We'll keep telling the stories they don't want you to hear. Stay safe and know your rights.
Investigation officially closed. For additional unedited footage, remember to like and subscribe. Thank you for trusting Bodycam Incident Reports.